Hello and welcome to today's Talking Point presentation. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today and pay my respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people listening today or in the future. My name is Julaine Allan and I'm Clinical Director at Turning Point in the Hamilton Centre and NHMRC Emerging Leader at Monash University. I'll be facilitating today's Talking Point, which is entitled From Lols to Lows, Rethinking NANGs and Youth Harm Reduction, presented by Professor Julaine Allan and Associate Professor Jacqui Cameron. Talking Points is a regular series of publicly available lectures that aim to inspire, inform and challenge our notions of what we know about addiction and its impact across society. We would like our webinars to be as interactive as possible, so please ask questions via the Q&A function for online attendees. The questions will be collated and answered by Julain and Jacqui at the end of the presentation. Our webinars are recorded and they're later made available to view on the Turning Point website. I'd like to introduce our presenters for today. Professor Julaine Allan is a Professor of Mental Health and Addictions at the Rural Health Research Institute at Sturt University and is a Senior Visiting Fellow at the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre at UNSW. Julaine's a researcher-practitioner in substance use and mental health, with a background in social work and human rights. She's worked in mental health, child protection, and substance use treatment. Her current research investigates the implementation of psychosocial interventions for substance dependence and the provision of drug and alcohol and mental health services for young people and people with cognitive impairment. Associate Professor Jacqui Cameron is an Associate Professor at the University of Wollongong and Honorary Research Fellow at the University of Melbourne. She's a dedicated social worker with over 2 decades of experience in practice, research, evaluation, and training across diverse settings. Jacqui serves as co-editor-in-chief for Advances in Dual Diagnosis, an international journal that encourages submissions on co-occurring mental health and substance use disorders from various contributors, including academics, practitioners, and those with lived experience. Additionally, she co-convenes the Australia-New Zealand Realist research group. Jacqui is dedicated to the translation of research into practice. Her work is characterised by commitment to evidence-based research combined with lived experience in the management of complex issues, including substance use, mental health, and domestic violence through a social work lens. It's my pleasure to hand over to Julaine to get us started on this presentation.
Thanks so much, Shalini, and wonderful to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. As Shalini said, our presentation today is called From Lols to Lows, Rethinking NANGs and Youth Harm Reduction. Jacqui and I are sharing the presentation. I'll start and then she'll do the middle bit and then I'll come back. To tell you about what we're going to talk about today, we're going to outline nitrous oxide use and the harms related to it. We're going to talk about the project stages that we've been through over the last few years. We're going to talk about the resource development process and then show you our Reddit content and TikTok and Instagram and talk about what next for research related to young people and nitrous oxide use. I'd just like to acknowledge the other members of our research team that can't be here today, Helen Simpson and Kenny Kaur from the University of Wollongong, our wonderful social work honours students, Hannah Walter and Juliana Bruno, who did their honours studies on various aspects of this project over the years, Sienna Redmond, our social media consultant, and Sarah McLean from La Trobe University, who's advised on the project throughout our work. So just to get everybody on the same page about what we're talking about and in relation to nitrous oxide use for recreational or social purposes, I'm going to overview what it is as a drug and then how people are using it that we've discovered from the literature and the research that we've conducted. Nitrous oxide is a naturally occurring product in the environment, but it was first synthesized as a gas in 1722. So, a really long time ago, and was used almost immediately as a recreational drug in what was called at the time laughing gas parties. It's since that time that its use as a dissociative anesthetic for pain relief has been discovered. It's used, you might have been given gas at the dentist, if you're getting a tooth extracted. It's often used during childbirth to relieve pain. It's also used as an additive to motor fuel in car engines, and Mad Max's movies are probably the classic example where they turn on the nitrous oxide tank and the car speeds up. And it's also used as an ingredient to aerate cream. So if you go to a cafe and you get whipped cream on top of your milkshake, it'll come out of a canister, and it's nitrous oxide that's whipping the liquid cream into a whipped cream product that goes on top of the drink. And it's that nitrous oxide that people have been using for a long time now to inhale and get the effects of it as a recreational drug. You can see the small silver canisters in the pictures on those slides there. They're the canisters that go in the whipped cream containers to aerate the cream. And so this is not a medical grade product that we're talking about. It's a product that's that's being used for something else. So there's some harms associated with those particular culinary products that you don't get from gas that comes from tanks that are used at the dentist, for example. So those small silver canisters are really cheap, from $1.90 to $1 each, and readily available in retail stores. Once inhaled, the effects last about a minute, and it's euphoria, sort of a dissociated effect. Some people report hallucinations and sound distortions, which is where the word nang comes from. The sound of nang, 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 nang that you can hear in your ears when you are using the drug. And nang is a particularly Australian term that is spreading somewhat, but it's well known in Australia, not so much overseas. So what we discovered back in 2016, when we first became interested in researching how nitrous oxide was used and why, was that not much data is collected on it. It sometimes appears in like the household drug survey, put in with other inhalant drugs like amyl nitrate or solvents, petrol, for example. More recently, questions are asked in the ecstasy and related drugs survey and in the global drug survey specifically about nitrous oxide use. But on the whole, we don't have good data about prevalence of use or, there's just not been a lot of research on it. You can see there in the middle photo, that's Jacqui on reporting or on a story in the Illawarra Mercury in Wollongong when we did our systematic review, talking about how easy it is to obtain nitrous oxide. So yes, you can buy it in retail shops in boxes of these canisters that are used to whip cream, but you can also go online to nitrous oxide retailers and get it delivered 24/7 basically in the larger urban centres. And then in 2025, there's another conversation story there that reports the results of our most recent research, which we'll be talking about today. This is some photos that my daughter sent me recently. She liked our harm reduction nitrous oxide pages on Instagram and TikTok. You've got to love it when your family supports your work. But since then, she gets constant advertising to buy nitrous oxide. And these are just a couple of photos that she sent to me from Nangs, Melbourne's place for late night baking and whipped cream supplies. You can see there that you can buy a 3.3 litre tank or two 3.3 litre tanks for $90 plus delivery costs from this online outlet. And you can see pictures of the tanks there, the red things that sort of look like as tall plastic containers in the bottom of the left-hand photo. Now, the small silver canisters these large tanks have given way, like they're the things that are used now. So instead of getting 1 gram of nitrous oxide in that small silver canister, people are getting a 3.3 litre tank that can be inhaled at will. So the quantity of the drug that people have available to them has increased substantially. So, you know, the dose has increased. You can see here a bunch of people inhaling nitrous oxide from a balloon. Most people decant it into a balloon because the gas is incredibly cold and it causes frostbite burns. So that can be quite serious injuries to your mouth, lips, tongue, if you breathe the gas straight in from the container that it comes in. On the photo on the right is one that was taken at a creek not far from my place in rural New South Wales. And you can see the rubbish that's left behind after people have been having a session with nitrous oxide. There's the balloons and there's the water filled with those small silver canisters. And it's this rubbish that's a frequent feature that alerts the community to people using nitrous oxide and increases community concern about what's happening, what are people doing, what is this strange rubbish that's being left behind, and what does it mean for safety and well-being in our community. The quote at the bottom there is from a police officer who was quoted in the story I mentioned earlier in the Illawarra Mercury. And it's this sort of approach to drug use that we want to avoid, you know. So this person is saying it's stupid, it's naive, it's flat out stupid to use nitrous oxide, and there's plenty of information out there because it causes sudden death. Now that sort of approach to informing people about drug use and its harms and helping them manage the risks associated with drug use has never worked. You know, to tell someone they're stupid is not really getting them on side to changing any sort of behaviour. So this is what we're hoping to do is the opposite of this approach to addressing drug use. So over to you, Jacqui.
Lovely. Thank you, Julaine. I'm delighted to be here. I do apologise. I do have a bit of a cold, so I do sound a bit not like myself. So apologies for that. I just wanted to quickly acknowledge that I'm on beautiful Darral country today in Wollongong, living between the ocean and the mountain and working on beautiful Darral land, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So as Julaine said, I'm going to be talking to you about the different stages of our work. So we've had several projects, several interconnected projects over the past few years in relation to nitrous oxide use and their harms. Our first study was actually a systematic review that Julaine mentioned earlier, where we looked at 36 publications, of which 16 were case reports, which was kind of interesting in and of itself because we were looking at the potential harms being reported from clinical presentations at that time. And so common clinical presentations from harms included things like muscle weakness, stumbling, and some rather more serious spinal cord injury and other issues. And it's interesting to note that often when we've done media work, there was the article that Julaine mentioned before, and our colleague Kenny and I actually did a radio interview a couple of months ago on the ABC, and even that triggered phone calls from distraught family members saying about the harms that had happened to their child, their sister, whatever, in terms of the more severe harms. So there certainly are case presentations around that. And from that review, we identified several areas that certainly warranted further work, and this was back in 2022, but they included things around policy development, service delivery and responding to harms, and understanding the nature and extent of harms, as Julaine alluded to earlier. In our second study, we conducted interviews with young people and to better understand their experience of nitrous oxide use. And these conversations revealed similar harms, notably around young people using nitrous oxide alongside other substances. As Julaine talked about before, some of the harms from the use in terms of being cold and being injured from using the nitrous oxide, that they try and hold their breath when they're using nitrous oxide because there's a perception that that will make a difference. And they also talked which was really interesting, about how it's used in groups, how it's used in cars, on the way to a house party. So you drive, you use your names, and then you drive again, and then you go off to gatherings and use different substances. So for us, that was incredibly interesting in terms of how it's used, where it's being used, and particularly the driving was of concern. That came up quite a lot, and it certainly resonates with another study that was done since our review in a Scandinavian country, which looked at a survey of harms from driving. So certainly drugs were used alongside nitrous oxide, included obviously things that we would be surprised: alcohol, marijuana, ketamine, MDMA. They liked the idea of, participants liked the idea of prolonging the substance. So NANGS was a thing that went with other drugs to make the high better. So now I'm going to talk to you a bit more about why we're here today, which is the sort of more recent project where we co-created resources. So if I'll get you to change slide, Julain. Julain's driving, thank you. So we're focusing today on the more recent study, which came out of that work from the qualitative work we'd done with young people, talking about the potential harms and what we could do about it. And so the aim of this study was to co-produce harm reduction resources based on our research findings and based on feedback from young people. It also involving young people. We wanted to make sure that they were part of the process. So to achieve these aims, we used a multi-stage process that included several workshops where we recruited young people to the workshops, we engaged them in the facilitation and resource development, and we also went through quite a detailed process of member checking. So the first focus group, which we ran, was with 22 young people, where we talked about the idea of harm reduction. We asked them what they knew about harm reduction, and then we talked about how that might translate into harm reduction around nitrous oxide use. And so people also at that focus group shared their own lived experience and their friends' lived experience, and gave us invaluable insights into the things we needed to be considering and thinking about in terms of harm reduction messages. And so then we went away and we developed a series of resources which involve video clips and posts to go on social media, which Julain's going to show you some of that final work later. And we went back to the young people at a third stage, where we got them to check out what we'd done and gave feedback. And these sessions were really detailed in terms of the review of each component of the resources we developed, and they were particularly shall we say, mindful of things like font color and font size, and they wanted to know where it was going to be posted. So they were really heavily involved in that part of the development, which was fantastic. If you can change slides, Julain, thank you. So in terms of that development, the stages of the research were really important, but what we did do when we were putting together the resources, so after that first focus group, we actually did have a look at what was available and what was out there. So on screen is just an example of something that we found on TikTok in terms of what was already out there in terms of the messaging around nitrous oxide use. So it was important for us to have a sense of what was already there, and there wasn't a lot, and there was also a lot that wasn't evidence-based necessarily. So we were very, obviously it was important for us to make sure we balanced the evidence base with people's feedback. So we were really mindful of that. So when we talked to the young people, we talked about the evidence around nitrous oxide use, we talked to them about the harm reduction messaging, and worked through what would resonate with young people, what would they buy into, what would make them click, like whatever the appropriate term is, onto the social media to get them engaged, to find out. And we certainly made sure that our resources were tagged appropriately, which Julain will talk to you about a little bit later. So I just wanted to give you some of the idea of, in terms of the workshop. The first workshop began with a discussion where we focused on what people knew about nitrous oxide, what they knew about the harms. We asked young people to get busy with drawing, as you can see as an example of the screen, of some butcher's paper. We got them into little groups and asked them to write stuff down that was important to them, and they were certainly very creative. And to guide that conversation, we said, what is nitrous oxide? What is harm reduction? And what harms have been identified in the research, and gave them free rein, really, to tell us what was important, to tell us what are the things they would watch out for, what were the things that would help them do it safer, what were the strategies, the kind of things that would be helpful. And then we got them to work in small groups to give us that feedback at the end of that first workshop. Next slide, please, Julain. And the feedback was super important, finding out what would resonate with the young people, and finding out in particular where we should put these resources. So we presented a range of options to them. So we talked about, is it going to be TikTok? Is it going to be Instagram? Is it going to be Reddit? Is it going to be YouTube? Is it going to be Facebook? Hell no, that's just old people. So we worked with the young people to really identify where, those likes or those ticks or whatever it is would happen and resonate with them. And they were pretty clear with us about TikTok being helpful, Instagram, Reddit, a little bit of help, but also really focusing on the first two. Next slide, please. Thank you. So during this process, we, of course, were collecting data, and we actually have written up that as a paper, which I'll give you the reference for that in a minute. It's still not quite through, but it's under review at the moment. But as part of that, we did evaluation along the way. So we made sure that during those sessions, we were recording, we were doing online live feedback. So we used Mentimeter to get feedback as young people were talking. They were able to provide anonymous feedback to us about the things that were coming up. So on screen is some examples of some of the comments that we received back. So the young people highlighted that the benefit of seeing harm reduction materials and engaging in these discussions allowed for a deeper exploration of their experience. They really enjoyed the easy to digest information that we provided in terms of the risks, and having stuff that was, bite-sized, something that they could hang on to and would certainly look at when they were scrolling on their phones. Another thing that was super important was the user-led messaging. So, what we thought was cool was certainly not what young people told us was cool. So we had to make sure what we were putting out there resonated with them. So language was super important. As one participant put it, what we came up with had a greater chance of working than something made up by people who don't know what they're talking about or haven't used it. So we really needed to make sure we were reaching our target audience and making sure that that co-creative approach that we took would work. Thank you, Julaine. So in between the workshops, we went away and were busy bees, where our social media consultant was a busy bee, pulling together all the potential ideas of how the content would work, where it would be placed, what the focus was on. And at the second workshop, we had the media content played in various forms and on various platforms. And again, during that, we had the anonymous feedback happening on their phones at the same time. So again, you can see some feedback on screen. It was very positively received. Again, this is where it was interesting, where things like font color and size and stuff that we hadn't necessarily anticipated, I don't think, seemed to be super important. So it wasn't just about the content, but it was how the content looked. And so, for example, you'll see when Julaine shows you the information, the video in a minute, but one of the videos originally had the young person in a room, and they kind of ended up being alone at the end of the thing, and they were like, well, that wouldn't happen. That's not real. That's not how a party works. So, it was great to get that feedback from them about how the messaging was coming across. So we used a polling approach in that second workshop, and we had questions like, how close is each of the clips that you've seen, in terms of what we identified in workshop 1. So we would play them the video clip, we would ask them a question, and then we'd get the poll and Zoom feedback, anonymous feedback from each message, so we could get, a gauge how well it was being received. And we had some really encouraging comments. So, for example, one young person said, you can really see that there has been consultation with the target audience. As a potential consumer, I'm incredibly appreciative. So participants provided feedback through the polls and the group discussions. And again, we went away from that final workshop and took on that feedback and refined the social media resources ready for launch. Next slide, please, Julaine. So on screen is just references to the 3 studies and the most recent article, which is not quite through yet, but hopefully will be through soon. So once the seminar's over, you'll be welcome to access our references from our 3 studies, but I will hand over to Julaine again.
I have to unmute myself. Never gets old, that one, does it? It's never going to go away, no matter how often we do webinars. So I'm going to show you the social media posts and the resources that were created through this process that Jacqui has just described. And on the sites Reddit, TikTok, and Instagram, which are the ones that were chosen as the most appropriate. So Reddit is mostly written information, and it's a site that has a bunch of other sites within it called subreddits. So Sienna, our social media consultant, trawled through Reddit looking for subreddits that had drug user information or people who were asking questions about drug use, particularly nitrous oxide, and posted a written document on those sites to provide people with information. On the left there, you can see TLDR, too long didn't read. So this is the short version of the document that was posted. And on the right down there, you can see some of the content comments that we got back from the various Reddit sites. It wasn't a straightforward process. Some of the sites that were very active in drug use or by people who were talking about their drug use were not interested in information about nitrous oxide, and were not interested in our particular harm reduction approach. But you know, the commenters also provided advice about the things that should be emphasised in terms of harm reduction, like you know, vitamin B12. As Jacqui mentioned, people can experience numbness of the hands and feet, urinary incontinence, even up to paralysis because of the impacts of vitamin B12 being depleted from the body. And that's something that was repeatedly mentioned by people who are concerned about the harms of nitrous oxide. This is our TikTok harm reduction page. So all of the videos, posters, different harm reduction information is posted on harm_reduction_N2O. So that's freely accessible. You can follow the page, you can search for it on TikTok, and you will find all of the materials that we have posted there, except for the ones that were banned. So even though on both TikTok and Instagram, we are identified as an educational resource site, it doesn't mean you can post videos of drug use freely and have them stay up. So what happens with the sites like the one I showed you earlier that's selling nitrous oxide is they just rebrand all the time, and they redo their site name and things like that. We haven't done that, but a couple of our videos were deemed inappropriate as social media content because they depicted drug use. So here's the first one, which is about take a seat. And of course, if you inhale a dissociative anaesthetic and you're standing up, you may pass out and become unconscious and be injured from falling over.
Planning on doing a name? Then plan on falling. Don't go down with a bang. Take a seat.
Okay, video 1. And this is video 2. Jacqui mentioned people thinking that you had to inhale nitrous oxide continually to get the most out of it, so to speak. So rather than breathing in the nitrous oxide and then breathing in oxygen, people would constantly breathe in as much nitrous oxide as they could, which leads to a lack of oxygen.
Is passing out still a part of the fun? Take a breath. It won't affect your high.
So, of course, what does happen is, you know, if you don't breathe in oxygen, is that you become unconscious. And that's certainly a concern, not just at times when you're standing up or if you're sitting down and becoming unconscious, but also if you are driving.
Your awareness is affected even after the high fades. Should we have one more and head to the party?
Let's have another. Actually, maybe we should walk instead.
Don't risk it. Nangs and driving don't mix.
Replaying the videos. So the driving thing's particularly concerning because the effects of nitrous oxide last about a minute. People don't realise the residual effect. So they might repeatedly breathe in nitrous oxide looking for that 1 minute intoxication, but not recognise that their reflexes are impaired for up to 45 minutes following inhaling the gas. And that certainly affects driving. In the Netherlands, as Jacqui mentioned, they linked nitrous oxide use to 1,800 car accidents in a 2-year period and 53 deaths. So there's no warnings out there about using nitrous oxide and driving because it's not recognised as being that harmful. This is a link to our Instagram page, same as the TikTok one. It is N2O harm reduction. I think it's harm_reduction1, something like that. One of the videos has also been banned from Instagram. It's the one that I showed you first of the girl sitting down and with the balloon in front of her face. That was considered inappropriate drug use content for Instagram, but the others haven't been banned, or people haven't had their access to them prevented. And you can see here that there's a number of posts that are photos. So if you click on the first one there that says doing a nang, it slides across and there's some more information on the next page, and it slides across and there's some more information in text-based form, as well as the reels that I've just shown you. So there's information available in a variety of ways, and in and focusing on different elements or different harms associated with nitrous oxide use. So the harms come from intoxication, where people fall over while intoxicated, or they come from regular and repeated use, which then causes physical and psychological harms, similar to, other drugs. You can see here some of the feedback that we've received, and our plan is to, at some point, collate all of the comments under the different videos and posts and use that to describe the impact of the research and the resources that have been created, and write about that. The TikTok feedback, this example here of this on the far right there is someone talking about developing neuropathy in their feet from using a lot of nitrous oxide, and the person on the comment on the left there is talking about taking copious amounts of vitamin B12. So one of the strategies that young people told us about that some of them knew about in relation to nitrous oxide use was taking vitamin B12 the next day after using nitrous oxide. While they understood that there was a risk of vitamin B12 depletion, they didn't understand that taking a vitamin B12 tablet the next day is not going to address that. And in fact, the vitamin B12 depletion lasts for a longer time, and it takes quite a long time to recover. So it's not just a matter of taking one vitamin tablet the next day after a session. You can see here that, we have these comments, just don't do nangs, of course, in any social media posts anywhere, anytime. There's people who are against the message or the thing that you're posting about. One of the interesting discussions that happened a few times is reflected in this discussion here on the right about hypoxia. So it came up several times, including in the radio interview that Jacqui mentioned, where people believe that it is the lack of oxygen to the brain that causes the intoxication that you feel, not the drug that causes the intoxication. I hope I've made sense with that. So this discussion on the right here is people saying, no, it's a person saying it's hypoxia that makes you high. It's not nitrous oxide. If that was the case, then you could just hold your breath and you'd get high. You wouldn't need the nitrous oxide to get the effect. But it is one of those beliefs that's out there and something that needs to be addressed through this material. Therefore, the Take a Breath video. This is our addiction commentary here. So Back et al. Back in 2022 published a paper in Addiction, a systematic review, looking to see if nitrous oxide use could meet the DSM-5 criteria for a substance use disorder. Now, at that time, it didn't, but that's because the research is limited, not because some people have a substance use problem related to nitrous oxide use. So I think what we need to do is understand that there are serious implications of nitrous oxide use. Okay, it might not be up there with tobacco, alcohol, and some of the opiate painkiller drugs as perhaps the most harmful that can be used. But it doesn't mean that for some people serious harms aren't experienced and that information is required to address those. I have a Google News alert, which means every day of the week I get information from media outlets all around the world about media stories on nitrous oxide use. And you can see a sample of them there that's just from a couple of days. I mean, I have hundreds and hundreds of stories that, I always think one day I'll do something with these and analyse them sensibly in a research fashion. But this covers the breadth of stories, I guess, that appear regularly in the media. So here's one about the laughing gas canisters piling up at Glastonbury, which is a large music festival in the UK, hundreds of thousands of people. And it highlights the concern about rubbish associated with nitrous oxide use. Another one here from British Columbia in Canada with concerns about nitrous oxide use at music festivals. Here, the picture of the large canisters that have the much larger amount of nitrous oxide compared to the small silver canisters. You can see one here on the bottom right photo. That's a huge amount of nitrous oxide that's available to people who are using it at a single time rather than, cracking open a small canister repeatedly. And this story on the right here highlighting oral frostbite injury when people get burnt by the gas. And often the burns will be on their hands as they crack open those small canisters. There's been some research more recently in the United States looking at deaths associated with nitrous oxide use, and it's, they're climbing, but still information is not well recorded. So that is it for our presentation, and I guess our questions are what next? We have all of those Google News alerts to work through. We have the comments from the social media posts, and Sienna, our social media consultant, is currently working on a UK version of the materials. So we'll remove some of the Nang language and replace it with language that's more familiar to people in the UK, do some geolocated ads so that young people in the United Kingdom can get access to the harm reduction material, where the circumstances are quite different. It's nitrous oxide in the UK is a Class C drug, whereas in Australia it is not illegal to use. It's only illegal in most places to sell it for the purposes of if you know somebody's going to use it for recreational use. Thanks, Julaine.
Thanks so much, Julain and Jacqui, for a really fantastic presentation about a whole body of work, really just with the harms, but also the really great kind of co-production resources that you've shared, and a deep dive into social media and dissemination strategies. We've got some great questions coming in through the Q&A. Encourage people to start popping stuff in there if you would like them answered by Julain and Jacqui in a minute. To start off with, there have been a few questions about the harms specifically with nitrous oxide. One specific question around the evidence around what's more harmful, whether it's the volume of use or the frequency of use. And the background is also some of the harm reduction advice that can be given out at, say, music festivals, where people might have some questions around whether using the entire tank at the festival is a good idea versus whether a person's more likely to go home with some remaining and continue using after a festival if that's what's given out. So the question is really around whether to reduce the amount in a single binge session or whether to avoid sort of that lower volume repeated use, and whether there is any evidence, I guess, pointing to either direction.
Well, there's not any, and there's not any clear evidence. It's not like, we have the standard guidelines for drinking alcohol and how many drinks you should have per day or over a week and what binge drinking is. We just don't have those guidelines, and there's no standard advice. But obviously, using a lot is not good for you, and people in our study talked about brain zaps. So after a binge use, they referred to brain zaps or brain freezes, where they would feel foggy for days afterwards, and that would affect their university studies, for example, that they couldn't concentrate. Those were the sorts of things people were describing from binging. I think the repeated use over a longer period of time is when people see the vitamin B12 depletion and the tingling in the hands and feet and things like that. But yeah, we need to know more.
I might, building on that, I might ask some questions around what the evidence is around recommending B12 supplements broadly for people who might be using regularly, but also, I guess, for young people. Is there any evidence or studies in that area?
Well, I think I alluded to it that, I don't think you can take, one vitamin B12 tablet the next day and that addresses what might have happened in your body from however much you used the night before. But as far as we're aware, and Jacqui could confirm this, it hasn't been investigated about the amounts of B12 that you need or how long you have to take it for. But there is those comments in our, in the social media posts that say, I've experienced this numbness in my feet and it's affected me for a long period of time.
And I think the other thing, Julain, is that feedback is now a little bit older. And from that point, when people were doing lots of what they called the nanginator and lots of little canisters, there's now the ginormous ones. And we've heard anecdotally recently of people having a pile of empty canisters in their hallway and getting the delivery for the next one. And we don't know what harms that's doing because we don't know. So, and I guess the other part is the difference between the medical, like there's medical use, but we don't know what happens when you are using it for not medical use, and we don't know what's happening when you're using the version of it that's not clean, if you like. Like in our interview, I didn't say this, but some of the young people talked about too the gunk that comes from using the nitrous oxide, because it's like commercial grade. So there's all sorts of crap in there, basically. So there's a lot of layers, isn't there, in terms of what we don't know, in terms of making helpful harm reduction messages around the medical impacts.
I think it sounds like also we might switch a little bit to talking about the process that your team used to look at sort of the co-design and the implementation and uptake of that, as well as some really interest and engagement from the people who've attended. And they're wondering, in terms of the process itself, if you had any reflections on that recruitment for people for that co-design process, of any tips and things that you might want to share about how you went about doing that, because I think they found other teams have found it a little bit difficult to find the right group and engage with the right group of young folk for this.
We had pizza. That was helpful. And we also got them to bring their friends. That was helpful too. It actually wasn't that hard, was it, Julaine? Like the young people we talked to were very interested and involved and keen to, like some of those comments said, like it was actually really not that difficult to recruit young people, and it's something we'd like to build on, certainly.
Yeah, and we use social media to recruit. So back in an earlier slide, you would have seen our recruitment poster that said, do you call Wollongong home or something like that? Our social media consultant revised that for us, and all of a sudden our recruitment got a lot better. But it was posted on student, buy, swap and sell sites. So obviously our cohort of people is a specific demographic of 18 to 25, 26-year-olds who are connected in some way to the university. And I think there's a lot of scope to look at other groups of people, for example, younger people like 15, 16 who are not going out drinking at licensed premises and are using nitrous oxide with and instead of alcohol in bush parties or beach parties or whatever, and also older people as well.
And the people using the larger amounts at home alone, like that's another group that we don't know anything about.
And I guess on that note as well, it sounds like one of the key points that in your presentation was really the value of that social media consultant role as well, and kind of designing the strategy and the uptake as well. Some of the questions relate to how that was approached, particularly around, say, for instance, with TikTok, questions around how they might have thought through how to reach the target audience and how to get populations that might be influencers or actually have a broader reach. Was there any discussion around that or options for that?
We did talk about reaching out to particular social media influencers, and some of the young people in the workshop suggested people like Friendly Geordies was one person that's just something that I've remembered. And there were other, social media influencers who were suggested. We didn't do that. And it's certainly an option for, expanding reach in the future. I guess those influencers would have to be prepared to be associated with, what some people might see as promoting drug use, which not everybody is happy about. But the advertising on social media sites is really effective to target an audience, so geolocated, age range, putting in, likes these types of products or sites or something. So you can actually, if you have advertising funds, which we did, we promoted our resources via advertising, you can really target those ads to a specific audience.
And it sounds like the other target population, there's been quite a few questions come through about high schools and whether there's any potential, or whether you guys thought about that already, about how you might reach that population.
Yeah, we definitely have talked about that, because obviously our target group was a bit older, and in fact in the interviews some young people kind of talked about their use as a kind of retrospective thing, as in when they were that age this is what they did. And so for us, it's really interesting to know that, and something that we would really like to explore further. And again, anecdotally, there's been some conversations about really young people as young as 10 in a park, using nitrous oxide. So working with colleagues in education would be a great next step, or another project to expand that. But as Julaine said, there's a number of population areas that we're really keen to do more work with to find out more, because there's it's a bit of a cliche, but we do need more research. We don't know a lot of things, so we need to do more work on it.
And just touching on another aspect around where more research probably needs to unpack is around the regulation aspect around canisters and nitrous oxide and the advertising too. Questions come up around marketing and labeling, especially for the larger sort of canisters or products. Is that something that your team has kind of thought about or advocated for?
Yeah, I mean, the regulation thing is like, you're not supposed to be able to advertise these products. So that advertising is regulated, but obviously there's a lot of loopholes and a lot of ways around it. I think people need to be more aware that the harms with the larger canisters seem to be greater, and we can't say that 100%, but that's what it looks like because of the quantity. Like, it's like if you do shots compared to having an alcohol that's mixed with other, a pre-mixed drink, like the more quantity of something that you take in, the quicker the harms escalate. So I guess the problem with thinking about regulation is it often turns to prohibition. And that's certainly the way other countries have gone, like the UK, like the Netherlands, which then causes a bunch of other problems for people who are then involved in the criminal justice system if they get caught using or possessing a particular type of drug. So it's a very complex thing to think about.
And just a couple of final questions. If anyone has any burning last questions, pop them in. Just the final last questions around, I guess, dose-related harms and also people who use more regularly or by themselves. I know we touched on, that there isn't a tremendous amount of literature to support that, but there are, I think, a fair number of clinicians, it sounds like, in the audience who are just wondering whether there is any suggestion around harm minimization strategies for young people who might be using alone or who might be using regularly.
Jacqui?
I wasn't sure who's jumping in. I mean, again, we certainly talk about the standard harm reduction strategies, I guess, in absence of not knowing enough about it in terms of giving specific advice. So it's more general harm reduction messages, which is what we worked on doing through these resources in terms of, not holding your breath and those sorts of things. Beyond that, we need more evidence because medically speaking, we don't know enough. I mean, that review highlighted, what did I say? I think it was 16 cases where there were obviously documented harms from a medical perspective, but we need to know more about that. And I think it would be interesting too to look at, for example, the ambulance data that you guys have at Talking Point. I'm wondering about, in terms of presentations, it would be interesting to look at across different states. What are the impacts in terms of the driving, the other drug use, and then explore that further to develop those messages in a more detailed way.
Yeah, we did do consultations with clinicians, like drug and alcohol services back a few years ago. And, they said to us, we don't see this.
That's true.
Nitrous oxide's not something that walks in the door of a,
drug and alcohol service.
Yeah, that's right. It's turning up at emergency departments and things like that when some intoxication related event happens. And very often it's not, nitrous oxide is not asked about, and people don't think that the symptoms that they're experiencing of numbness or nerve damage are related to their nitrous oxide use. So there is one of those case reports that Jacqui mentioned is about a young person who spent a year in a wheelchair before they worked out what was causing the paralysis. So clinicians could ask more about nitrous oxide. But just, going back to the harm reduction advice, it's the same with this drug as with any other, like preferably don't use alone and preferably don't do it every day. And I would suspect, but I don't know for sure, that doing one of those whole large tanks on your own is probably not a good idea.
And certainly in terms of what young people talked about, they were mostly using in groups, but there was it feels like now there's been a shift. Like I feel like with the bigger canisters, there is more alone use. And again, this is not something we can say for sure, but it does feel like that's happening given some of the media reporting we're hearing. A journalist contacted us a few months ago, Julain and I, to talk about stacks of canisters outside the uni buildings and talking about students staying home to use, which Julain alluded to as well in the presentation. So yeah, there's certainly scope for us to do a lot more work.
It sounds like it's also hitting on some trends that people are seeing both in the community where you guys are, but I think a lot of questions around in Victoria as well. That's definitely something that people have been commenting on as well. Just a final question around some questions around how people can access some of the resources aside from the social media material. Is there any way to access either in other formats?
Not yet.
The Alcohol and Drug Foundation has good nitrous oxide resources on their website that are downloadable. There's links to their material on some of the posts on our pages, and to the research literature as well. The Reddit article has a lot of links to the research literature, and there's some sites like Erowid and Wikinaut. Have I got that the right way around? Particular drug user interest sites that have good information about nitrous oxide that produce resources. So you can find it if you search for it. But yeah, it takes a bit of looking.
Not necessarily specific to the groups, like not targeting kids at school, not targeting the different groups. It's more generic, isn't it? So yeah.
And I think when this presentation, which will be going online shortly, the recording will be on the website. Also, people will be able to access that after the talk. And so I think that's another way for people to kind of access some of the resources and the links, which will be embedded in there. And just some feedback from people in the post. It's Psychonaut Wiki, Arrowhead, Blue Light, all of the other have great resources on them. And Harm Reduction Victoria also have a post specifically on nitrous as well. So
it is out there.
Out there for people. All right, might just check with Julain and Jacqui if you have any last comments. A really fantastic presentation, I think really relevant to a lot of people who work in this area. So really appreciate it. Is there any last final comments from you both before we wrap up?
I think it's important for us to think about, what's next. Like we said, what's next, and we've got lots of ideas, but it's always, of course, a challenge to get funding. So we're keen to, collaborate and think about other opportunities. So if people do have ideas along those lines, please reach out to Julain and myself because we're keen to talk further. Thank you.
Thank you for giving your time to spread this information. Really appreciate it. Thank you. Just join us.
Thanks, Julaine.
Thank you. Cheers.